We'll just adjourn that general meeting and introduce tonight's speaker. So, Tami Hirasawa. And a lot of people recognize Tami, and I see she has some good support from Seven Potatoes. Awesome. She's from the Central Vancouver Island Japanese Canadian Society, a nonprofit organization dedicated to celebrating Japanese heritage. Tami is Nikkei Sansei, third-generation Japanese Canadian, and she's pleased to be president of the Seven Potatoes, which she was appointed in May 2021. Originally from Hamilton, Ontario, she currently studies classical Japanese dance. No, I can't say that.
It's okay.
With her teacher, Mari Kanita of CVIJCS in Arizona. Tami and her husband Dave practice the art of Iaido, Japanese swordsmanship, and Todokai in Nanaimo. Very interesting speaker we have. Excellent. Oh, good. We got a few more people coming. So, are you ready to go?
Yes, I'm ready to go. Thank you so
welcome.
much. Yeah,
welcome.
Thank you so much, Susan and Gord and the Nanaimo Historical Society. I'm really happy to be here talking to you today. I would also like to acknowledge with gratitude that we're meeting today on the traditional ancestral territory of the Nanaimo Coast Salish people who've been stewards of this land for thousands of years. And who continue to be important members of our community today. I also acknowledge that the homes taken from the Japanese Canadians stood on land earlier taken from the Indigenous peoples, and their struggle against injustice continues today. My talk today will focus on the history of the Japanese Canadians in Nanaimo, and the views expressed in this presentation are the thoughts and opinions solely of myself and not necessarily of the Seven Potatoes or the Nanaimo Historical Society. Before the turn of the century, immigrants from Japan arrived on Vancouver Island and worked as fishermen, farmers, loggers, and miners, mostly young single men. This is a picture of my grandfather sitting down on the log right in the middle of this photo. He's very proud of the work that he's doing. He's kind of like 6 over, sitting right there. Yeah, that's my grandfather. There were logging camps on Vancouver Island that hired mainly Japanese immigrants. One of the biggest ones was in Deep Bay. This is my grandfather's certificate of naturalization with the Dominion of Canada, which he received in 1910. He wanted to declare his loyalty to Canada, so he became a naturalized Canadian in 1910. But in 1895, all Asian and First Nations people were denied the rights of Canadian citizenship. So they couldn't vote or serve as work in government or even work in professional jobs. To give you an idea of what it was like in British Columbia in the early 1900s, I want to tell you about the Asiatic Exclusion League that was formed by Vancouver Trades and Labor Council on August the 12th, 1907. Their main purpose was to keep Oriental immigrants out of British Columbia. The mayor of Vancouver, Alexander Bethune, and many city councillors were the founding members of this all-white society. Not even 1 month after the AEL was formed, they held a rally in downtown Vancouver. Thousands of people marched through the streets on September 7th, 1907. They held signs that read, "Keep Canada White," and "Stop Yellow Peril." The meeting quickly turned into a violent mob who smashed all the windows in Chinatown before heading to Powell Street, where many of the Japanese Canadians lived. The Japanese Canadians had seen what had happened a few blocks over in Chinatown, and they armed themselves with sticks, rocks, and knives. They threw rocks from their roofs and stood their ground in the street until the mob finally dispersed. The police did not try to stop the violence. The records show that the attack caused businesses over $70,000 in damages, and that was in 1907. The Canadian government made no effort to root out the racist fervor that sparked the violence. In fact, Canada worked to prevent immigration from Japan further. The Gentleman's Agreement of 1908 severely limited the number of male immigrants from Japan. The Asiatic Exclusion League continued to have strong ties with politicians. And in this advertisement, it says, "For your children's sake, vote the Asiatic League ticket for," and then it lists all the racist politicians running for this 1921 election. Okay, so back in Nanaimo, there were three main areas where the Japanese immigrants settled between 1880 to the 1930s. So Stillip and Seisetsun, which is Departure Bay, Newcastle Island, and some of the other islands in the area. The second area was Hammond Bay, Neck Point, Piper's Lagoon, and Shack Island, which was used by the fishermen. And then the Brecon area along Stewart Avenue was one of the major, largest permanent settlements of the Japanese Canadians. So I'm going to start with the herring salteries and boat building. When Japanese fishermen arrived in Canada, they brought a wealth of experience and new technology to the fishing industry. They were very successful in their fishing endeavors, but because they did not have the right to vote, they had no say over policies. So fishing licenses were restricted for the Japanese. Very few were allowed to fish for salmon, and the Japanese had to stay to these restricted areas of the coast, whereas the non-Japanese could fish anywhere in the 5 districts. Well, this brought them to Nanaimo, where the herring was plentiful. In 1903, Mr. Archie Ikeda established a herring saltery and a reduction plant that turned herring into fertilizer and fish oil. But the government closed down his fertilizer business, so he expanded to his herring saltery. The herring salteries in Departure Bay on Seisetsun, Jessie Island, Protection Island, they were a huge economic force in Nanaimo starting in 1890. The government was not wanting the Japanese to be allowed to fish at all in British Columbia. Non-Japanese people did not think herring was edible for food at the time, and it was used largely as bait. But the Japanese developed salted herring and exported it to Japan, Hong Kong, mainland China. There was such a particular demand in China where there was a huge tax on salt, so the Chinese imported salted herring to use in their cooking instead. This brought a wealth of business to Nanaimo. And in the 1920s, Nanaimo was known as the herring capital of the world. And this is from the Nanaimo Art Gallery exhibit, Tides and Moon's Herring Capital by Cindy Mochizuki. That was at the Nanaimo Art Gallery last fall. Here's a photo from the Nikkei Museum archives. And it shows how all the fishermen worked together in the herring industry. And they used boats called seiners, which had these huge nets, and they would like gather all the herring up. And I see a lot of people nodding. And then they'd have 2 boats, and between the nets, they would catch the herring and bring the nets together and bring them in to the scows. In 1907, 5 more herring salteries were built on Seisetsun. Rikimatsu Tabata built a saltery on Jessie Island. And this picture here is part of Cindy Mochizuki's exhibit showing the Japanese-Canadian daily life in Nanaimo in the 1920s. In 1909, 14 salteries operated along Stewart Avenue waterfront from Town Line Road to just south of St. George Street. So in today, it would be from the Nanaimo Yacht Club, probably down to Carlos O'Brien pub. In 1912, 4 of the Japanese-owned salteries on Seisetsun burned down mysteriously. Arson was suspected at the time, and the salteries were rebuilt. This was a recurring problem with the herring salteries being burnt down and then being rebuilt again repeatedly. This photo is from the collection at the Nikkei Museum archives, and I'm not sure if in the background, if that is Stewart Avenue or if that is Newcastle Island. Okay, Protection Island. So there were in 1905, 5 herring salteries were built on Protection Island. And this is Denny Provost. He's painting a mural on Protection Island. Is Denny here? Can you stand up? So this is, yeah, and you've just done this summer, correct? Yeah. So this is the mural that Danny has. Is it on your fence?
No, it's one of the Islanders' fences, yeah.
It's absolutely wonderful. I'm just so delighted that Japanese-Canadian history is being depicted on Protection Island, and the mural is just wonderful. And up in the corner It says, these are the names of the owners of those sultries on Protection Island in 1907. In the mid-1920s, it was legislated that in the herring sultries, 50% of the crews had to be non-Asian. So Indigenous and European Canadians were hired to work in the herring sultries. The Japanese Canadian owners of the sultries treated everyone fairly and provided 10-minute coffee breaks mid-morning and mid-afternoon. The camps also had recreational activities. In 1940, all sultries were ordered closed, and all herring catches were diverted to canneries to be shipped to Britain to feed its troops fighting in Europe. Japanese boat builders brought highly technical boat building skills to Canada in the early 1900s. In 1918, T. Matsunaga and two Ode brothers started the Nanaimo Shipyards Limited to build and repair vessels essential to the operation of the sultries. It was a large operation with 4 marine ways, a machine shop, and accommodations for its 30 employees. Former employees talk about how much fun they had working at the Nanaimo shipyards. They had table tennis, swimming, chess in the evening, and rowing across the bay to town on Saturdays. In 1941, the Canadian Navy confiscated the Nanaimo shipyard and its fleet of 19 boats. At war's end, the yard was dismantled and all the holdings were sold off. This Japanese boat, called the Soyo Kaze, was the only boat where the original owner, Mr. Shigekazu Matsunaga, when he lost his boat when the government confiscated it in 1941. It was sold at auction to a white fisherman. Mr. Matsunaga repurchased his fishing boat after the war in 1957. He used the boat for cod fishing on Quadra Island until the family decided to donate the boat to the Campbell River Museum in 1999. And you can still go see this boat. It's outside at the Campbell River Museum. Japanese Canadians called it Kujira Bay, or Whale Bay, due to the whaling station on the north end. The area included Hammond Bay, Neck Point, Piper's Lagoon, and Shack Island. Many Japanese Canadian fishing boats stopped in the bay to rest before heading up the coast toward the Skeena and Nass rivers. It was a hot spot for cod fishers. The colorful shacks on Shack Island can be reached by foot at low tide. The shacks were made of driftwood and logs salvaged from the beach by Japanese Canadian fishermen in the early 1900s. The largest, most permanent Japanese Canadian community took root in the Brecon area of Nanaimo along Stewart Avenue. This map was created by Ian Baird, who's researched the Japanese Canadians in Nanaimo. There were over 40 families in the Brecon area. The majority of families who lived along Stewart Avenue were fishers, but there were also mill workers, truck drivers, shopkeepers, shoemakers, and Japanese language teachers. This looks like they've been foraging for mushrooms. There were 25 shops in the area. So it's quite a bustling, thriving community. Frank Koyama was a well-respected businessman in Nanaimo. He established his business in 1918 as a seafood wholesaler. He also had a wharf, an ice manufacturing plant, cold storage shed, fishing vessel fleet, and a general store. And this I just pulled off of the Nanaimo Museum Instagram. But it shows the Koyama the Koyama business that started in 1918, and it went until 1941. In the 1930s, the second generation Nisei and third generation Sansei population increased, and the parents built the Japanese language school at the corner of Juniper and Stewart Avenue. The building was also used as a community center for various events, including funerals. The Japanese parents wanted their children to maintain the Japanese language and culture, as well as being able to maintain discipline in the home and help with business transactions with other Japanese Canadians. Okay, so I had another slide with Japanese children in it. But I wanted to let you know that the anti-Asian racism in Nanaimo at the time, the Nanaimo chapter of the Native Daughters of British Columbia held fundraisers to distribute this pamphlet called The Argument Advanced by Native Sons of British Columbia in Opposition to Granting of the Oriental Franchise. So a lot of the Japanese Canadians were trying to get the right to vote, but there were a lot of groups that were stopping, that were against it. Other examples of anti-Asian racism in Nanaimo were swimming pools in Nanaimo did not allow Japanese Canadians to use the pool until the white patrons had finished their swimming. The Capitol Theatre on Bastion Street only allowed Japanese Canadians to sit in the upper balcony, and the bowling alley in Duncan posted a sign that said, "No Orientals allowed." Canada entered the war against Germany in 1939. The War Measures Act was enforced, but the RCMP announced in March 1941 that all persons over 16 years old of Japanese race living in BC had to be registered. This included naturalized Canadians and Canadian-born, as well as Japanese Canadian veterans of the World War I. They were required to carry this card at all times, and at this time, Canada is not yet at war with Japan. This is March 1941. To show their loyalty to Canada, many Japanese Canadians bought victory bonds. The poster on this side says, "Invest to ensure your freedom." And records show that Japanese Canadians bought $300,000 in victory bonds during World War II. And then in December 7th, 1942 was the attack on Pearl Harbor, and Canada declares war on Japan. There was an immediate mass seizure of all Japanese Canadian fishing vessels. This happened within hours of Canada declaring war on Japan. The next day, December 8th, the government started impounding all Japanese Canadian-owned fishing vessels. Boat owners were escorted with their vessels to assembly points. They had already registered every Japanese Canadian in BC, so they knew where all the fishing vessels were. All fishing vessels were confiscated and eventually sold at auction without the consent of the owners, who were forcibly removed from the West Coast and incarcerated in internment camps. In January, February 1942, all male Japanese Canadians 18 and over were forced to leave the 100-mile restricted zone along the coast of British Columbia and sent to road camps along the Trans-Canada Highway. So my mom's brother had just turned 18. This is my Uncle Jack, and he's sitting here in the white shirt down kind of in the front. And they were forced to do heavy labor to build the Trans-Canada Highway. This photo was taken in Griffin Lake, which is way in the Rockies near Three Valley Gap. And my grandfather and 18-year-old uncle were forcibly removed from the family in February 1942. If anyone spoke out or resisted, they were sent to a POW camp in Angler, Ontario. Many Japanese Canadians were sent for minor infractions like staying out past the curfew, or not carrying their registration card, or protesting the split up of families. There was a curfew that was imposed. It was dawn to dusk. No Japanese Canadians could be out past dusk. And the mass incarceration of Japanese Canadians begins. March 1942, Japanese Canadians ordered to turn over their property and belongings to the custodian of enemy alien property. And it says, for temporary safekeeping. So if you can see this, this document is a list of Yoshitaka Terunishi's property. Everyone had to list everything that they owned, and in it it describes his home at 1212 Stewart Avenue with a shed in the back. And it lists his furniture. He's got a bureau with a mirror, 2 beds, baby crib, baby bath, table and 4 kitchen chairs. He's got tools, fishing nets, garden tools, laundry tub, washboard, box of clothes, tin of flour, tin of sugar, box of groceries, dishes, pots, pans, everything was listed. This document on the, your right, is Yoshitaka Terunishi's 30-foot fishing boat called Kiyo No. 3, which he had valued at $2,500, and it was sold for $440, of which they deducted advertising fees, auction fees, and administration fees. And then this document here is the house at 1212 Stewart Avenue. This was a later document where they're figuring out how much everything was worth. All usable items were, and it says right at the bottom here, the house at 1212 Stewart Avenue and shed has been ransacked. And all usable items were stored in the Japanese language school. The shed was empty except for an old fishing net which was left there. So this is right on the document here. All roads on Vancouver Island led to Nanaimo, where the Japanese Canadians were put on ships and sent directly to Hastings Park to be housed in the livestock building. So this is starting in March 1942. This is the livestock building at Hastings Park at the PNE. The women's dormitory had bunk beds set up. My mother talks about hanging the sheets between the bunk beds for privacy, but they could never cover up the smell of the horse's feces that lingered. She had to share the top bunk with her sister, while her 2 other sisters shared the bottom bunk. Her 2 younger brothers, who were 12 and 14, had to sleep in the men's building. Her father, an 18-year-old brother, had been sent to the road camp in Griffin Lake. This was further separating the families. Overall, 22,000 Japanese Canadians were incarcerated. Not a single act of disloyalty. 77% were Canadian citizens. This map shows the 100-mile protected zone, and any Japanese Canadian living within the 100-mile zone was forcibly uprooted, displaced, and had their belongings confiscated, sold at auction, and dispossessed. You can see the red dots are the internment camps, and the green triangles are self-supported settlements, and the black sort of parallelograms are road camps. What to take and what to leave. Some families were only given 24 hours notice that they had to leave Nanaimo on the next ship. And they were restricted to 1 suitcase each, with baggage allowance of 150 pounds for adults and 75 pounds for children. Families were forced to take only what they could carry. How do you tell your child that they have to leave behind their favorite thing or their pets? What they had to leave behind, the government promised to keep and trust until the owners return. The promise was broken, and their homes, properties, businesses, and personal effects were seized and sold off. The largest internment center was called Tashmi, which housed 2,600 Japanese Canadians. It was very cold for those used to living on Vancouver Island, and very muddy. My mother talks about arriving at New Denver, and her family had to live in a tent until the shacks were built. When the shacks were built, they used very thin green wood that shrunk once the boards dried out, leaving large gaps in the walls that let the cold, frost, and snow inside in the winter. Each shack had a wood stove for cooking and heating in the center room, and then there was a bedroom on each side. And many families had to share a shack, and each family got the 1 bedroom, and then they shared the center room. Toilets and outhouses were situated away from the shacks. These camps were situated deep in the interior. They had mess halls where everyone ate together. Remember that men and older boys were working in the road camps, so the family did not really eat together. Food poisoning and tuberculosis were common in the camps. New Denver had a sanatorium where many Japanese Canadians went to be isolated. And you can see in this picture, the shack is fairly new, and then behind it, there's a tent in the background, if you can see that. So some of the families were in the tents. So Japanese Canadians were told that they could stay together as a family if they worked on a sugar beet farm in Alberta or Manitoba. The work was highly labor intensive, and the pay was not enough to live on. The living conditions were horrible. Each farmer provided shelter for the family that was living on their property. Sometimes it was a grain shed, other times it was an old chicken house. None of the Japanese Canadian families had running water. My mother remembers getting off the train in Iron Springs, Alberta. The Japanese Canadian families all lined up on the platform at the train station. The sugar beet farmers all came and looked over the families. Like they didn't want like the families with the young babies or the elderly with mobility issues. They wanted families with strong young boys who could work their fields. And my mother was reminded of the slavery in the South. Meanwhile, back on the coast, the custodian of enemy alien property was given the right to sell off the Japanese Canadian property without the owner's consent. Many families did not find out that their property was sold until months or years later. BC made it clear that they didn't want the Japanese Canadians returning to the coast. So they had a choice. Japanese Canadians could choose between exile to Japan, and 77% of them had never been to Japan, or you could move east of the Rockies. In the end, 4,000 Canadians were shipped to Japan, and 13,000 Canadians moved east. The war ended on September 2nd, 1945, but Japanese Canadians were not allowed to return to the west coast of Canada until April 1st, 1949, 4 years after the war ended. Yeah, and April 1st, 1949, Japanese Canadians were allowed to, given the right to vote in BC. 4 families returned to Nanaimo in the 1950s. This photo is Kashi Ueyama, who looks quite happy to be spending Christmas in Nanaimo in 1950. So Walt Shimizu, Noburo Ueyama, and Takeshi, this is a Takeshi, also called Kashi Ueyama, and Tokuko Yoshida. Now, Tokuko Yoshida and her husband Aki Yoshida came back to Nanaimo in 1960 and started the Grotto restaurant. I'm sure many of you recognize this menu that included the kitchen sink and the really good veal cutlets. It was a popular Nanaimo establishment. The 1977 Japanese-Canadian Centennial was a commemoration of the arrival of the first immigrant from Japan to arrive in Canada. The year-long celebration across Canada brought together Japanese Canadians for the first time. Up until this time, Japanese Canadian families were spread out across Eastern Canada and trying to fit in with their white neighbors where they were relocated. In Nanaimo, a celebration was held at the Grotto restaurant. And this was the beginning of the Japanese Canadian Society in Nanaimo, with 32 families. During the 1980s, Stanley Fukawa, who was the founding president of the society, asked the members if they wanted to be part of the redress movement. Nanaimo members were reluctant. They felt that if they became too visible, there would be backlash from other Canadians. They did not trust the politicians or the government that had betrayed their trust, and they did not want to revisit the pain they had endured during the war. The Seven Potato Society voted to not be involved in the redress movement. Some who were not discouraged actively marched on Parliament Hill, but they did receive anonymous phone calls and hate mail at their Nanaimo home. There were long-term consequences of the internment. On September 22nd, 1988, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney formally apologizes for the wrongful internment, seizure of property, and disenfranchisement of thousands of Japanese Canadians. Much work has been done over the years to rebuild a Japanese Canadian community in Nanaimo. Our community formally became a society in 1985 to cooperate with matters that concern Japanese Canadian community and undertake collective action for the betterment of its social and cultural well-being, to meet socially, to promote better understanding and appreciation of our Japanese cultural heritage, and to promote human rights, a multicultural Canada, and stand in allyship along marginalized people. Since 1921, the Seven Potatoes has been working with the city of Nanaimo to plant cherry trees in city parks. The Seven Potatoes have been fundraising to purchase the Japanese Akebona cherry blossom trees, and the city has committed to plant and maintain the trees for everyone to enjoy. We've already planted 26 Japanese cherry blossom trees, and they're in Bowen Park, down by the lower picnic shelter here, Rockridge Park in North Nanaimo, and at Bevan Park along Bowen Road. The sakura trees are significant to Japanese people. They bring beauty in the spring when they bloom, and they remind us of the fleetingness of life when the blossoms fall to the ground. And we're still working on planting another 100 trees. In closing, I'd like to once again quote Masako Fukawa, and she says, "Today, as Japanese Canadians, we stand on the shoulders of our Issei and Nisei pioneers who endured and triumphed over adversity. Their indomitable spirit, gaman, giri, gambare, perseverance, self-sacrifice, and determination is their legacy to us and to future generations." You can visit our website, sevenpotatoes.com. And I just want to give a very special thank you to Masako Fukawa, who provided me with so much content, research, and her own work. And there's a number of books by Masako Fukawa on the back table that I brought, as well as Masako's ongoing support of the Seven Potatoes in all our efforts. I also want to thank Cindy Mochizuki, Ian Baird, Denny Provost, Imogen Lim, Brian Sugiyama, Robert Hewer, Keiko Limshu, and Mina Shoda and the City of Nanaimo Archives. A big thank you to Nanaimo Historical Society for allowing me the opportunity to share this story. I have some references if anybody's interested. And thank you very much. If anybody has any questions.